All right. So today we're talking about chapter one of the staff engineer's path, and uh, also anything from the forward or intro that if you might have read those areas. So I added a few points to start us off. So the first one is on the topic of management versus IC paths. There's a quote: "If you really see or could see 5 years ahead in both of these paths, you'll find they have a lot of in common, but at the start they look quite different." And that's something that kind of stood out to me because as I've talked to more and more staff plus folks, um, I hear that a lot. That there's a lot of overlap in what you're doing, and then I also hear a lot that many people have at some point already been a manager by the time they ended up choosing the staff path. And so that idea of the like staff and manager pendulum seems pretty common. So I was kind of curious if we have any people that are either on the manager or staff paths that have any thoughts on that idea or wanted to share their own experience. If not, that's fine too.
I mean, I can. I've been staff and EM at other companies before, GitLab, and there's a definite overlap in my experience in terms of skills that you end up using. Um, it's really sort of a like what are you spending your time focusing on, and like what do you consider your output? But the skills and the perspective, the place that you're sitting and looking at things is different depending on which path you're taking.
Thanks.
Not a big
Um,
insight there. Sorry.
yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, and I think yeah, they kind of touch on that in the book a little bit about some of the different skills that come into play. Even in just looking at the leadership aspect, it can be a little bit different from one side to the other. Um, let's see, the second item that I noted from the intro section was kind of addressing the non-technical skills. So there's one that stood out to me, which is framing a problem so that other people care about it. And I think this is something that I've seen a lot in our staff engineers. And so I know that having authority can drive other people to care about your opinion more, whether or not that's intentional. But I'm curious, what other ways can we better frame things so that other people care when you don't necessarily have that authority? So like maybe you're just, you're a senior engineer or intermediate engineer, or you're working with a set of peers where you don't necessarily have that sense of authority. Um, and my first thoughts were, including facts, anything that's backed with facts is easier to kind of push forward. And then taking time to examine other people's perspectives before offering your own opinion to make sure you've really thought about, not just I want this, but like why would other people want this? It looks like Haley, you have a thought on that.
Yeah, and I don't uh, quite remember where I learned this specific phrasing, but um, I've heard of thinking in terms of painkillers versus vitamins. So people don't like taking vitamins, they don't like doing preventative work. Um, what they like doing is having painkillers. They like stopping something negative that's happening presently. And so it can be helpful to think of um, describing your problems in that way, like what is it causing us now versus and like what is solving this problem get us immediately. If you're a psychology um, person, this is nonlinear temporal discounting, and you get this, you know, even things that are very kind of mild in intensity that happen sooner have a bigger effect than things that are have a bigger intensity but are happen later after the action you take. So even if something seems relatively minor, if it's something that's closer in time, um, it can have like an outsized impact compared to um, what you might think the absolute value, say, of that impact is.
Yeah, I think that actually reminds me a lot of something that very specifically that you worked on that I happen to know, which is the container registry. Um, we have all these ideas for features like in the future, but we needed to implement garbage collection and a metadata base. Um, and sometimes that doesn't look that appealing, but when you point out like this costs us a lot of money right now, suddenly it's very appealing to a lot of other people. So it's a really good point. All right. Does anyone have any other things they wanted to chat about from the forward or intro before we move into the chapter one? All right. So I've got a couple more points here. So the first one is engineering norms are set by the behavior of the most respected engineers on the project. So what norms do you see at GitLab that fit this description, and how do you contribute them, or how do you contribute to them or provide your own? Tom?
Yeah, so this is just some examples I've seen. There's many, many more, which is awesome. So I think the first one is sort of setting a respectful tone in discussion, being respectful of other people's contributions, and also having that discussion in public. There's also a very awesome and very detailed incident reviews, which really, really help. And it's very nice to learn from as well. And then there's this bias for actions. Small fixes, helping out with shared tasks. So those things. I guess they're also driven from the GitLab values, which is also nice. I think.
Yeah, just something that I see and try and emulate is the comment convention, especially like the praise aspect. When you see something like when you're doing an AMER review, remembering to praise people, I think is a really values aligned thing that we do at GitLab. Haley?
Tests, which is something you might not think about working at GitLab long enough, but if they're not there, and sometimes they're not, it's a big problem.
To expand a little bit on the respectful discussion and feedback and merge requests, the accepting of feedback is also one that's really prominent in GitLab. It's really great.
Awesome. Those are some really good examples. Cool. The next point is mine again. So this one I thought just kind of like summed up at least what I assume is going to set the tone for a lot of the book, which is just staff engineering as a leadership role. So like what does everyone think about that statement? From whatever level or perspective you happen to have, is that something that you agree with or have thought about before when considering like what it means to be staff? Take the silence as mostly agreement, probably. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think that most roles have some kind of leadership, unless you're like a junior, right? Most roles have leadership. So I guess I wonder, how does it change as you move up to staff? Is it just that more is expected of you?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think hopefully this is not too tangential, but I think one of the things reading this chapter was how common it was for staff engineers to actually not write a lot of code and do more design work and collaboration across departments, sections of a company. So I think that's part of the leadership aspect is you're not necessarily in the trenches, as it were, quite as much as other engineering roles.
Yeah, and also there's some parts about saying what you say no to is really important at the staff level, like, and leaving things you could do for other people to use those as a learning opportunity. That stood out to me.
Could I ask the staff engineers in this call just around that idea of that staff roles may not necessarily be so kind of code oriented, just whether or not that has been their experience, and if so, positives and negatives around that for them personally, if anyone has any thoughts.
Well, certainly at my last job, I was a staff level and I was a staff test engineer. And I wound up having to bounce back and forth between being hands-on on the frameworks as well as trying to architect out the frameworks and how they all interacted together. At that company, we had, well, it was an application built up of about 2,000 repos written in 107 languages. So the frameworks had to, we couldn't have one framework to rule them all. So figuring out how all those pieces fit together wound up being a major chunk of my time, and wound up getting occasionally in trouble with management for not being hands-on quite as much as they would like, but somebody had to take the big picture and help architect how all the pieces went together.
I can share a story as well. I at a these are also stories about previous work. I'm just newly staff here. So one is I really feel the advice about learning what to say no to protect your time. I did that very poorly. My first round of that level, and totally burned out. I think the better I learned through my mistakes, that the better use of my time was being an advocate for people who didn't feel that they had enough voice to raise their concerns, and trying to build bridges between work groups that didn't really communicate and didn't understand each other's needs. There was partly a barrier of mutual understanding is difficult to achieve if you don't, speak the same language and have overlapping sets of concerns. So building that rapport by framing things in a way that mapped to both of the competing groups' sets of concerns was really, really fruitful in getting them to work better together and unblock each other rather than be a blocker for each other. I think that kind of bridge building becomes easier to do the more experience you accumulate and the more trust you build across teams. So I think that's part of the work that you can leverage at these higher levels. That's my opinion.
Yeah, that's good points. I feel like it's more that advice it needs to be quite nuanced. Like, I think at my previous job, I bounced between being very code oriented because I was first starting out as a staff level, to being very not code oriented, and both extremes were very harmful, because it really didn't solve the problem, and I think this is why I say it depends. You really need to look at the problem, understand the problem, and disseminate your understanding of the problem, and how you achieve that depends on the problem, right? So sometimes you do need to dive into the code, write some POC. Sometimes you're just organizing backlogs, right? So it depends, definitely.
Yeah, it also sort of depends on me on how much of your time you're spent being a force multiplier. Because certainly to me, being a staff, you're there to multiply everybody else's effectiveness. And if you're hands-on on code, you can't really be affecting other people directly that much because you're affecting code. So it's sort of a juggling act of keeping your skills up and helping everybody else out.
Andy, I think you're touching on a really important part of that, which is that staff isn't so much like a progression on the ladder, but it's a role, right? So it's like it's a different job than being a straight and pure engineer. You have all these other responsibilities, like organizing backlogs or finding the proof of concept, or getting in and writing the code that makes it able for other people to do an extra 2% of their work, or 3%, or 10x, if you will.
I was just going to add, for what it's worth, just being on the management side, although I think I'm the only manager on this call, I have managed staff engineers who have asked for more opportunities to write code. I think staff engineers, as we've talked about, have had more opportunities to maybe do what we're calling more leadership aspect of things. So my only point here was just to encourage folks to keep that open dialogue, and to make sure if you were interested in writing code, to make that opportunity available to you.
All right. Can move on to the next item here. This is my last one. So there's a section about writing out your understanding of your job and sharing it with your manager. And there was a big example of what that looks like. And I thought that was a great idea, not only for staff, but for any level of engineer, and maybe even beyond engineering. And it seems like the kind of thing that can definitely be done like regularly to kind of realign with your manager. And I was curious if anyone's done this. Like I know we all might have career conversations, but actually going through the exercise of writing out like this is what I think I'm doing versus maybe what you think I'm doing. And if so, like how did that work out?
Well, certainly I've done that. At my last job, we wound up, well, there were three of us that were staff level, and no one in the company really knew how to use us. So we created a document of this is what it means to be a staff engineer, and this is how we see we can help teams. Unfortunately, we wrote it up and then started circulating it with upper management, and then there was a big management shakeup, and it sort of died in that process. So I can't say it drove much change, but it helped us in formulating how we see ourselves functioning, and we used it to drive how we interacted with teams more than the company.
Awesome.
I
Haley?
think,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say, I think GitLab, I don't have, yeah, I think GitLab does a good job of describing what the roles are. Like it's in our public handbook, at least in AppSec, it's like big bullet point list, which I like. And then the performance review that we just did was aligned against that. Or at least, for me, I just copy pasted here's what was expected of me at this level or at the staff level. Because I was, I guess, trying to position myself as a staff potential person. And you can just talk to that. So I thought that was the last performance review was quite useful for discussing this sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the experience I've had as well is working off of that handbook page and kind of just comparing notes along the way. All right,
Yeah.
Haley, you've got the next one.
Yeah. So I think something that struck me in the book was that being in a leadership position, but also not having authority is actually like could be like a beneficial aspect of the role, because if you're a manager and you're the technical aspect of this role, but you're also like writing people's performance reviews. They are probably not going to be as keen to say like, I don't think this is a good idea. I have another, I have a reason why I think we should try something else, because there's an inherent power imbalance there that is beyond experience.
It was the biggest, one of the biggest changes for me when I made staff last summer was how many people actually listen to me with, I have something to say, or like people like want me to weigh in on things in a way that I didn't have before. It's like things I have absolutely no earthly concept of this piece of the product or experience with it, but you want me to like evaluate it or something. It was very astounding, and it's part of that, like the social fabric changes, because you are outside of that hierarchical structure, so you can be this voice, and an advocate for different things in different ways.
I've got number 5. If people, yep. So what does it mean to be in the room, in quotes, where decisions are made at GitLab? So in chapter 1, it said, if you want to influence the technical direction of your org or business, you'll find yourself gravitating towards opportunities to take a broader view. You'll need to be in the rooms where the decisions are happening.
Yeah, so I think working groups are probably the formalist version of that we have here. But I think, I don't know how all teams do that, but they're often in the package stage, big discussion topics, where we invite feedback to sort of like the larger direction, medium size kind of efforts. And I think that's kind of like the normal GitLab workflow place for that kind of input to happen.
Okay, I'll talk. There's also architecture blueprints as well, which is an organized way to discuss big changes to the code base, and various Slack channels. um, yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing for me, is like keeping an eye on Slack, just clicking on random stuff, watching random unfiltered videos, so I can become aware of other bits of work going on, so that I can jump into the room once I find out it exists, if that'd be useful.
I've found
think
that go ahead.
Oh, I'll just say I'll add. I think I'm the only front end engineer on the call, but we have the front end RFCs group or project as well for front end big changes.
I was just going to add that I found that like if I am curious about something or a specific meeting that maybe seems like a manager only type meeting, usually like people are receptive to letting you join in, and shadow it, or at least sharing some of the information from it, if you ask. Like I know some meetings like you don't want to overcrowd, but I've never like asked about a topic or a meeting that I wasn't able to like eventually like kind of like learn about either indirectly or directly.
Perhaps this is a bit silly, but sometimes I've come across proposals inside of issues or epics, and while I'm a person who may not have a contribution to said proposal, I at least do make sure I hit the little notification icon so I get pings on stuff like that in the future, and I could read about that in the future as it progresses over the course of time. I'm sure a lot of people here do that, but just to call it out.
I'm curious about how folks feel about this. So the book characterizes talks about characterizing yourself as a useful framing as being a depth first versus a breadth first kind of personality. And I've used this framing for myself for many years. I'm depth first for sure. A lot of the answers I'm hearing are here to this last question really kind of reflects sort of a breadth first survey kind of style for discovering new topics. Does anyone have any thoughts on how? I guess I'm kind of curious how folks feel about exploring things in a depth first manner. I imagine that would take the form of things like having choosing particular areas of to build a greater depth of domain expertise and staying plugged in those particular channels, whether they be Slack or RFCs or design docs and whatnot.
Yeah, so I've worked on the container registry project for my entire tenure here. So that's coming up over 3 years now. And it's not a small project. So I think it's just picking a place and starting to dig a hole, basically, and not digging another hole. And so I like it. It is container registry is big enough where I don't quite know. I can know most of it, but there was an MR upstream, which I'm also a maintainer, and it was a part of the a code that I haven't touched before. And it was like walking into a room in your house you didn't know was there. It was that same feeling of how does this exist? But you know, having that sort of knowledge and that context, I like it, and being able to provide kind of a nuanced answers to why things are and are not possible. I really do enjoy that.
Fantastic. Thank you for that response. For what it's worth, I feel the same way. It's I think there's a lot of benefit to being able to speak to. We're probably at time, aren't we? I'll just say that I think that there's a huge benefit to having both styles in your pocket and collaborating with people that have a complementary style.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining, and I'll kind of just stop us there, but feel free to add some notes to the items after the time. And yeah, we'll see you all next week for chapter 2. Bye.